When a little girl was left in a wildlife reserve, a tiger spotted her crying on a dusty road. This majestic beast, with eyes sharp and wild, fixed his gaze on her and unleashed a thunderous roar as he stepped closer. What happened next was nothing short of astonishing. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the dense canopy of the Indian Wildlife Reserve in hues of amber and gold. Michael adjusted the brim of his weathered ranger hat, his boots crunching against the gravel path as he began his morning patrol. At 34, he was a fixture here, a man whose life had intertwined with the rhythms of the jungle. Lean and suntanned, with sharp green eyes that missed little, he carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent years earning the trust of the wild. This wasn't just a job to him, it was a calling. The reserve, sprawling across miles of untamed forest and rolling hills, was his sanctuary, a place where he'd found purpose amid the chaos of nature. Michael paused by a familiar tamarind tree, its gnarled branches stretching like an old friend's arms. He inhaled deeply, savoring the earthy scent of damp soil and the faint musk of distant animals. The air buzzed with the chorus of waking birds, a soundtrack he'd come to know by heart. But beneath it all, there was something else today. A faint, unfamiliar sound that tugged at his instincts. He tilted his head, listening. It wasn't the growl of a predator or the rustle of prey. It was softer, more fragile. A child's cry. Meanwhile, deep within the reserve, another soul stirred. Rajan, a Bengal tiger with a coat like burnished copper, lifted his massive head from the dew-kissed grass. At 6 years old, he was a creature of contradictions. Wild yet tethered to a past that blurred the line between beast and companion. His amber eyes, fierce and unwavering, flickered toward the sound. Rajan's story began years ago, when Michael had stumbled upon him as a shivering cub, barely a month old, tucked beside the lifeless body of his mother. Poachers had left their mark that day, a bullet in her flank, a legacy of greed. Michael, then a younger ranger still finding his footing, couldn't walk away. He'd cradled the cub in his arms, his hands trembling not from fear, but from a strange, unspoken promise. Raising Rajan hadn't been easy. Michael spent sleepless nights bottle-feeding him, coaxing life back into his frail frame. He taught the cub to hunt, to stalk, to survive, skills that would one day return him to the wild. When the time came, 2 years later, Michael released Rajan near a riverbank, his heart heavy but resolute. He'd expected the tiger to vanish into the jungle, to forget the human who'd been his lifeline. Yet Rajan lingered in a way Michael couldn't explain. During patrols, he'd catch glimpses of those amber eyes watching from the shadows, not with menace, but with a quiet recognition. It was trust, forged in the crucible of their shared past, a bond that defied the natural order. Now, as Rajan rose to his feet, his muscles rippled beneath his striped hide. The cry grew louder, a desperate wail that pierced the morning stillness. He moved with purpose, his paws silent against the forest floor, weaving through the undergrowth toward the dirt road that skirted the reserve's edge. There, in a patch of sunlight breaking through the trees, he saw her, a tiny figure huddled on the ground, her dark hair tangled and her ragged dress streaked with mud. Asha was 3 years old, though she didn't know it herself. She'd woken to an empty world, her small fist clenched as she sobbed, abandoned by a mother she couldn't name. Rajan stopped a few paces away, his breath a low rumble in his chest. Asha's cries faltered as she looked up, her wide brown eyes meeting his. To her, he was a giant, a shadowed shape with teeth that gleamed and claws that could rend stone. She froze, her breath hitching, too frightened to scream. Rajan circled her slowly, his tail flicking, his gaze unblinking. He was a predator by nature, a king of this domain, and yet something held him back. Perhaps it was the echo of his own helplessness years ago, a memory buried deep in his bones. Or perhaps it was Michael's voice, a faint thread woven into his instincts, whispering of protection rather than prey. Asha shrank back, her tiny body trembling as Rajan's shadow loomed over her. His presence was overwhelming, 6 feet of muscle and sinew, a force that could crush her without effort. He lowered his head, sniffing the air around her, his whiskers brushing the dirt. For a moment it seemed inevitable. The tiger would strike, and the child would vanish into the jaws of the wild. But then Rajan's ears twitched, his head snapped up, his body tensing as a new scent reached him. Sharp, hostile, creeping through the tall grass beyond the road. Another tiger, an aggressive male, had been tracking the same cry, drawn not by curiosity but by the hunger for territory. Rajan's lips peeled back, revealing fangs that glistened in the dawn light. He stepped forward, placing himself between Asha and the unseen threat. The little girl, still clutching her knees, stared at him, her fear giving way to a flicker of confusion. Rajan's massive frame blocked her view of the grass, his tail lashing like a whip. Then, with a suddenness that shook the earth, he unleashed a roar, a sound so primal it seemed to ripple through the trees, a warning that echoed across the reserve. Asha flinched, covering her ears, but the roar wasn't for her. It was a challenge, a line drawn in the dirt between life and death. Back on the trail, Michael's pulse quickened. He knew that roar. It was Rajan's, unmistakable in its depth and power, but it carried an edge he hadn't heard before. Urgency, defiance. He broke into a run, his rifle slung across his back, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. The sound had come from the eastern boundary, near the old dirt road where the reserve met the outside world. His mind raced with possibilities. A poacher, a rival predator, an accident. But nothing prepared him for what awaited around the bend. As the trees parted, Michael skidded to a halt, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the middle of the road, stood Rajan, his Rajan, facing off against a shadow in the grass. And beside him, impossibly small and fragile, sat a child. Asha. Michael's heart thudded against his ribs. Had Rajan found her, hurt her, saved her? The questions collided in his mind, but one thing was clear. The tiger he'd raised from a cub was no longer just a memory of the past. He was a protector, standing guard over a life that wasn't his own. The air trembled in the wake of Rajan's roar, a sound that rolled through the reserve like thunder chasing a storm. Asha, still crouched on the dirt road, pressed her small hands tighter over her ears, her wide eyes darting between the tiger before her and the rustling grass beyond. She didn't understand the danger, but she felt it, an electric charge in the stillness, a shift that made her heart thud painfully against her ribs. Rajan stood firm, his massive paws planted like roots, his amber gaze locked on the tall blades swaying 30 feet away. His tail lashed once, twice, a metronome counting down to chaos. From the grass emerged the intruder, a male tiger, larger than Rajan, his coat a darker shade of rust streaked with scars. His eyes burned with a feral hunger, not for food but for dominion. This was no stranger to the reserve. Michael had glimpsed him before, a solitary beast driven from a neighboring territory, now staking his claim. The rival's lip curled, a low growl rumbling from his throat as he stepped onto the road, his claws glinting in the morning light. He'd heard Asha's cries too, but to him she was irrelevant, a fleeting distraction. Rajan was the prize, the obstacle between him and control of this stretch of jungle. Rajan didn't flinch. His ears flattened, his muscles coiled beneath his striped hide. He'd faced threats before, leopards, wild dogs, even the occasional poacher's trap. But this was different. The child behind him shifted the stakes. He could feel her presence, small and trembling, a faint warmth against the cool earth. Instinct screamed at him to flee or to fight for himself alone. But something deeper held him in place, a thread of memory, of Michael's hands lifting him from the dirt years ago, of safety given when he'd had none. Now, he was the shield. The rival lunged, a blur of power and rage, his jaws snapping inches from Rajan's throat. Rajan twisted, meeting the attack with a swipe of his own, claws raking the air. The two collided in a whirlwind of fur and fury, their roars merging into a single, earth-shaking bellow. Dust billowed around them, kicked up by thrashing limbs and slashing tails. Asha scrambled back, her tiny frame pressed against a fallen log, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't scream. She couldn't. Fear had stolen her voice, leaving only the sight of the monstrous dance unfolding before her. Rajan fought with a ferocity Michael had never seen in him. The rival was heavier, his blows landing with bruising force. But Rajan was faster, more precise. He ducked beneath a swipe and sank his teeth into the intruder's shoulder, drawing a snarl of pain. Blood flecked the dirt, dark and glistening, as the rival reared back, shaking Rajan off. For a moment the two circled, panting, their eyes locked in a silent vow of no retreat. Then the rival charged again, aiming not for Rajan but for the gap where Asha sat. Rajan reacted in an instant, hurling himself into the rival's path, their bodies crashing with a sickening thud. The impact sent them tumbling, a tangle of stripes and snarls, until Rajan pinned the intruder beneath him, his jaws hovering above the exposed throat. Michael rounded the bend just as the fight reached its peak. His boots skidded on the gravel, his rifle half raised before he froze. Breath caught in his chest. The scene hit him like a punch. Rajan locked in combat, the rival thrashing beneath him, and impossibly a child mere feet from the chaos. His mind reeled. A girl, here. Alone? His first thought was Rajan. Had he attacked her, dragged her into the wild? But no. The tiger's stance told a different story. Rajan wasn't circling prey, he was guarding it. Michael's grip tightened on the rifle, torn between instinct and disbelief. He knew Rajan's heart, but this defied everything he understood about the wild. The rival bucked, claws slashing Rajan's flank, and for a heartbeat Michael feared the tide would turn. Blood matted Rajan's fur, a stark red against the copper, but he didn't yield. With a final guttural roar, he drove his weight down, forcing the rival's head into the dirt. The intruder's growls weakened, his thrashing slowing as exhaustion set in. At last, with a defiant snarl, he broke free and staggered back, retreating into the grass. Rajan stood his ground, chest heaving, watching until the rustling faded into silence. The threat was gone. Asha stared, her small hands clutching the log, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Rajan turned to her, his amber eyes softening as the adrenaline ebbed. He took a step closer, then sank to the ground beside her, his massive body a wall between her and the jungle. His breath came in heavy puffs, steam rising from his snout in the cool morning air. Asha flinched at first, her body tensing, but Rajan didn't move. He simply lay there, a sentinel of fur and muscle, his presence no longer a terror, but a strange comfort. Hesitantly, she reached out, her tiny fingers brushing the tip of his tail. Rajan's ear flicked, but he didn't pull away. Michael lowered his rifle, his heart pounding as the pieces fell into place. Rajan hadn't hurt her, he'd saved her. The realization washed over him like a tide, mingling awe with a pang of guilt for doubting the tiger he'd raised. He took a cautious step forward, his voice low and steady. "Rajan, it's me. Easy. Boy." The tiger's head lifted, those familiar eyes meeting his. There was no threat in them, only a quiet acknowledgement. Michael's gaze shifted to the girl, her fragile form dwarfed by Rajan's bulk. She looked up at him, confused but unafraid, as if the tiger's protection had steadied her. He moved closer, each step measured, his boots soft against the dirt. Rajan watched him approach, then rose with a slow, deliberate grace. For a moment their eyes held, a silent understanding forged over years. Then Rajan turned and padded toward the trees, his tail swaying like a metronome in reverse, counting back to calm. He paused at the edge of the jungle, casting one last glance at Asha before melting into the shadows. Michael knelt beside the girl, his voice gentle despite the tremor in it. "Hey, little one, you're safe now." She blinked up at him, her hand still outstretched where Rajan's tail had been, and Michael knew, in that instant, that their lives had just changed forever. The jungle exhaled as Rajan vanished into the trees, the rustle of leaves swallowing his shadow. Michael knelt in the dirt, his knees pressing into the earth still warm from the morning sun. Asha sat before him, her small frame trembling faintly, her brown eyes wide and searching. Dust clung to her cheeks, streaked by tear tracks, and her ragged dress hung loose over her thin shoulders. She didn't speak, perhaps she couldn't, but her gaze darted from Michael to the spot where Rajan had disappeared, as if tethering herself to the only constants in this bewildering moment. Michael's chest tightened. He'd faced down storms, poachers, and predators, but nothing had prepared him for this. A child alone in his wild sanctuary. "Hey," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected. "You're okay now. I've got you." Asha blinked, her fingers curling into the dirt as if testing its reality. She didn't pull away when Michael extended a hand, palm up, an offering rather than a demand. Slowly she placed her tiny hand in his, her skin cool and fragile against his calloused fingers. He lifted her gently, cradling her against his chest, and stood. Her weight was feather-light, a stark reminder of how vulnerable she was. Questions churned in his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? But for now, he pushed them aside. She needed safety, and he could give her that. Michael carried Asha back to the ranger station, a modest outpost nestled at the reserve's heart. The wooden walls creaked as he stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of coffee and old paper. He set her on a chair, wrapping a spare blanket around her shoulders. She clutched it tight, watching him with a quiet intensity that made his heart ache. He radioed for help, local authorities, a medic, but his focus stayed on her. She sipped water from a tin cup he offered, her small hands shaking less with each passing minute. When the medic arrived, a brisk woman named Priya, she confirmed Asha was unharmed beyond scratches and dehydration. She's lucky, Priya said, her tone clipped. But where's her family? That question gnawed at Michael as the day wore on. Authorities scoured the area, finding no trace of parents or guardians. Michael knew the reserve's boundaries weren't impenetrable. Gaps in the fence had let poachers slip through before. But a child? He turned to the security footage, a grainy feed from cameras perched along the perimeter. Hours later, hunched over a flickering screen, he found the answer. The footage showed a woman, her face obscured by a shawl, slipping through a break in the wire just before dawn. She carried Asha, her movements hurried but tender. At the edge of the road, she knelt, pressing a kiss to the girl's forehead, her shoulders shaking as if sobbing. Then she set Asha down, turned, and fled into the darkness beyond the reserve. Michael replayed the clip, his throat tightening. This wasn't cruelty, it was desperation. He'd seen it before in the eyes of villagers near the reserve, people crushed by poverty or circumstance. Maybe she'd hoped Asha would be found, cared for, given a chance she couldn't provide. The realization settled over him like a heavy fog, both heartbreaking and clarifying. Asha wasn't lost. She'd been left, a fragile gift to a world that might prove kinder than the one she'd known. The authorities searched for days, but the woman vanished without a trace. Asha's silence offered no clues. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just watched the world with those solemn eyes. Social services arrived, their voices brisk and official, outlining the next steps. An orphanage, a system to take her in. Michael nodded, but the words felt wrong, like stones sinking in his gut. He'd spent his life saving creatures, Rajan, the cubs he'd nursed, the birds he'd freed from snares. Asha wasn't so different, was she? Abandoned, fragile, yet resilient in a way that mirrored the tiger he'd once held in his arms. When the social worker mentioned the orphanage again, Michael interrupted, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. What if I kept her? It wasn't a whim. The thought had rooted in him the moment he lifted her from the dirt, her hand in his. He knew the challenges, paperwork, a life uprooted, a bachelor ranger turned father. But he also knew the alternative. An orphanage might care for her, but it wouldn't see her, not the way he already did. The officials hesitated, then agreed to a process. Background checks, home visits, a trial period. Michael didn't flinch. He'd fought for Rajan's life once. He'd fight for Asha's future now. Months later, the papers were signed. Michael stood in the station, Asha at his side, her small hand tucked into his. She wore a new dress, blue, her favorite color, he'd learned, and her hair was neatly braided, a task he'd fumbled through with surprising patience. She still spoke little, but her eyes brightened when he smiled at her, a quiet trust blooming between them. He'd named her Asha, Hope, because it fit, because it was what she'd given him without knowing it. The reserve was her home now, its wild expanse her playground, its creatures her silent companions. That afternoon, they took their first drive together through the reserve. Michael's old Jeep rumbled along the dirt paths. Asha perched beside him, her hands gripping the seat as she peered out the window. The jungle unfolded around them, trees arching overhead, birds darting through the canopy, the distant rumble of a waterfall. As they passed a familiar bend near the eastern boundary, Michael slowed. A shadow shifted in the undergrowth, and there he was. Rajan, his copper coat catching the light, his amber eyes steady and calm. He stood at the edge of the trees, watching them, a king in his domain. Asha gasped, pointing, and Michael chuckled. That's Rajan, he said, his voice soft. He's family in a way. She tilted her head, then waved, a small, tentative gesture that made Michael's heart swell. Rajan didn't move, but his gaze lingered, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had brought them here. Michael smiled, resting a hand on Asha's shoulder. Rajan had needed saving once, a cub lost to the wild. Now he'd saved her, and in doing so he'd saved Michael too, from a life of solitude, from a purpose that had grown too quiet. As the jeep rolled on, Rajan faded into the shadows, but Michael knew he'd always be there, watching over them, a guardian in the wild. This story ends with a powerful truth. Hope binds us, whether through Rajan's fierce loyalty, Michael's quiet courage, or Asha's resilience. It's a story of unlikely guardians and second chances, showing how compassion can bridge the wild and the human. Rajan saved Asha, Michael found a family, and together they remind us that kindness shines even in chaos. I hope you felt that spark too. What moved you most? Rajan's roar or Michael's choice? I'd love to know. Huge thanks to you all for joining me on this journey. Your support keeps these stories alive. If you liked it, please hit like, subscribe for more, and leave a comment with your favorite part or ideas for future tales. Let's keep sharing stories that inspire. Until next time, stay kind and take care.